It might be endless, but there was always a beginning. And for them, it all started with a question way back in 2010. How did the next billion people entering the modern economy get access to computing? A hard one to be sure, especially when cost is such a critical factor. This question is what Matt Dalio set out to answer. Desktops. As it turns out, in Endless's case, to go forward, a step back is all that's necessary. In a time when desktops in the established market were giving way to laptops, and laptops were giving way to tablets, most people in emerging markets, in India, China, and the Americas, couldn't get their hands on many of those devices. If 2010 was the year of the endless idea, then 2011 was the year that it died. At least it was supposed to. In his next journey, Matt set out to discover the reasons the idea, the desktops, and whatever comes after, wouldn't work. And after a few months of traveling to support a foregone conclusion, Matt concluded that it could actually work, but it would be a long shot. China, India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Thailand. Computers may not be ubiquitous, but TVs were. Cable and satellite set-top boxes were too, and those were computers, without the usual software after all. What was missing was a keyboard, a mouse, and Endless. To carry out the vision, Endless Mobile Inc. was founded, and the groundwork was laid to start working on bringing computing to people who hadn't had any or enough access before. Matt Dalio, Whitney Clark, Marcelo Sampaio, and Nurici Sanchez. This was the team on the first day of the rest of Endless, set on May 14th, 2012. The rest of 2012 was dedicated to building software for already existing technology, like cable and satellite set-top boxes using Android, and attempting to turn it all into a desktop operating system. There were successes, of course, and setbacks too. But more and more, the limitations in Android and in the hardware kept showing up, and eventually, reluctantly, the team trashed the idea of Android as a desktop, and almost all of the hardware too. The feedback gathered, lessons learned, and the prototype all survived to inform the next steps Endless would take. In 2013, Endless got the opportunity to beta test their software with a little under 1,000 volunteers in Brazil. Between this and many talks with folks within the free software community, caused another upset, another trashing of the assets, and a start from almost scratch. This time, with Linux and GNOME 3 as the chosen stack. A choice that remains in place today. Version 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3 were all released within the year. The releases seem to follow semantic versioning. The first number is the major version that would likely be incompatible with previous versions. The second number is a minor version that won't break compatibility but usually includes additional functionality. And the third number is a patch number, reserved for backward compatible bug fixes. Later in the year, we learned that user interest was there, but also the investor interest was obviously there too. An opportunity arose. 100,000 computers just waiting for Endless's software. But the team had to stop and reconsider. The offer was for Endless, the software, and would require Endless, the company, to become just another service company. No more hardware tinkering, and the mission would end. Instead, Endless doubled down. It's time to make software and the hardware to go with it. And within a couple of months, Echo, the newest endless prototype, made its way into classrooms in Guatemala. Some hardware lessons were learned. From fried SD cards to busted units, it was clear. When it worked well. But when it didn't, well, it didn't. In 2024, internally anyway, Endless 2 had released, but focus was split with hardware as well. Something was brewing, and it turned out to be pretty big for the startup. Endless OS versions 1.4, 2.0, and 2.1 were all released this year. Endless began a Kickstarter on April 14th, 2015 to fund the Endless PC, an Intel Celeron-based device whose aesthetics said, if aliens were able to extract the essence of an iBook G3 and then made an affordable PC with it, yeah. The tier that got you an Endless PC was set at $169. It would require a keyboard, mouse, and monitor. But the real goodies would be pre-packed on the internal 32 gig disk. Add $20 more for Wi-Fi. An option with a 500 gig disk and Wi-Fi was also available at $229, all at around 29 watts. The $100,000 Kickstarter hit 25% of its goal within a few hours, 50% within a day, and 100% of its goal in less than a week. When it closed on May 15th, Endless had taken in $176,000 from over 1,000 backers. Computers started shipping in late June of that year. Endless OS version 2.2 and 2.3 were also released this year. In January 2016, Endless showed off another product, the Endless Mini. Like its bigger brother, Endless, but it came with an AM Logic S805 ARM processor instead. It had an $80 and a $100 configuration. After the Kickstarter was done and all that new hardware was shipped out, a renewed focus on the desktop appeared, and work toward version 3 of the desktop began. In August, Endless 3.0 was released and was the very first Linux distro to adopt Flatpak for apps and have it configured for use out of the box. It shipped with GNOME 3.20, a new App Center, and dropped 32-bit support. In September, 3.0.3 is the first release for public download. Prior to this, everything was pretty much just internal only or on hardware only. Then in October, Netflix and Flash were broken. Google took out crucial bits from the browser that allowed this to work out of the box, but luckily, putting those bits back wasn't too hard if you were technically inclined. But if you weren't, in 2017, January, Endless Mission 1 and Mini are released. The Mission 1 was priced at $249 and was originally sold in the US only. With a Celeron processor, 2 gigs of RAM, a 500 gig disk, and wireless connectivity, it would certainly suffice as a learning machine. Its wood finish looked pretty cool too. The Mini, priced at $130, came with a Cortex A5 processor, 2 gigs of RAM, and a 64 gig solid-state drive. In January, 3.1 is released, with a focus on better accessibility, theming, and pushing for Flatpak improvements. In March, 3.1.3 is released with bug fixes, of course, but the interesting bit here is that ISOs are now available for the first time. Anybody can now grab one and spin up their own Endless OS in true distro hopper fashion. 3.2 released in July, and it brought better search and a refreshed desktop, passwordless login by default for ease of use. And 3.3 in October had a few bugs that 3.3.5 released in December fixed and brought a multi-language picker while typing in a password. In 2018, 3.4 was released in May, which added limited data plan configurations, good for where internet is spotty, better updating, and a companion app for Android. It also added Ad Block Plus to Chromium by default, a personal fave decision. In November, 3.5 is released, but was then quickly withdrawn because of a bug in the software that would reclaim an auto-configured swap from disks larger than 100 gigs. It left users stranded at a grub prompt upon reboot. However, it did bring with it the ability to create a portable endless USB, and getting updates through the App Center for those is pretty trivial. Later in November, 3.5.1 is released with a fix for the swap issue, among a laundry list of others. Early 2019, the original version of Hack, now named Hack 1, was released to teach kids how to code using built-in games and content called quests. This original version was pay-as-you-go. After a free trial, the new content added to Hack would require a paid subscription. Later in 2019, Endless launched the Hack Key, which allowed portable use of Hack on almost any computer, as long as that computer had a 1080p screen. In June, 3.6 is released with Podman support to run Docker-compatible containers. It also fixed an issue when installing Flatpaks because it temporarily needed twice the amount of space, as the files downloaded to one place and then copied to another. In October, 3.7 released with GNOME 3.34, AAC codecs built right in, color emoji support, and a ton of new hardware support thanks to the newer kernel. In November, Hack underwent some big changes. It became free and will now be added to all versions of Endless. New content was added through characters in-game. Ada had games. Stel had photo and 3D editing. Riley teaches you web design. Faber teaches maker stuff. And Saniel will teach operating system terminal tricks. Also, you no longer need a 1080p screen. On April 1st, and totally not a joke, Endless drops its for-profit status and becomes a not-for-profit. Endless says the move will allow it to place itself more strategically to help close the digital divide between the folks that have access to resources and those that don't. Later in April, 3.8 is released with GNOME 3.36. Better parental controls, which was started at Endless and made it to the wider GNOME ecosystem, and a pre-release for the Raspberry Pi 4. VM images for easy Endless in a box are available now for VirtualBox and VMware. In November, 3.9 is released with GNOME 3.38, and in this release, Hack and Friends go fully open source. In June, the Endless laptop. Turns out it was a second time, but using the same idea as their previous hardware, but now in a laptop form factor. The idea is $1 a day to access it, and after 18 months, the laptop is yours to keep. Also this year, the Endless Key begins distribution, a 120 gigabyte small USB drive that gives the power of Endless anywhere. You can still create one yourself, of course. The zip download, though, is approximately 75 gigs. In November, 4.0 released, dubbed the Light Touch release. Still thinking in semantic versioning, there was never a 4.1, but there certainly was a 4.0.1. This is because 4, based on Debian, brought with it long-term support. Also, fast user switching, driverless printing, and the Pi 4 support we were waiting for. Exactly 1 year later, on November 22nd, 2022, 4.0.13 was released to fix some bugs and would be the last true bug fix release of the 4 series. In January of 2023, 5.0 released and adopted GNOME 41 on Wayland. It brought multi-touch gestures and a better multitasking overview. More and more apps are being dropped in the system side and installed with Flatpak instead. This time, Calculator, Shotwell, and gedit, to name a few. Now, I know I said 4.0.13 was the last bug fix release, but I guess 4.0.14, released in February, fixed one bug. That is, if you consider being on old major versions of Linux distributions to be a bug. Users of Endless 4 can now upgrade to 5 with this release. Endless has funded and will continue to fund development of the tools that it uses. This includes GNOME and Flatpak development, and of course FlatHub. But this makes a lot of sense, since folks like Nuritzi Sanchez and Robert McQueen had held or currently hold board positions in the GNOME Foundation. That includes a recent injection of $100,000 from Endless to be put to use at FlatHub, announced by none other than Robert McQueen.